My brother Graham and I hadn't lived together since I was 17. Back then, we fought over stupid things. Who drank the last of the milk? Who didn't take out the trash? But after a few years living apart, we were closer than ever. Maybe that's why moving in together seemed like a good idea. For me, it was about getting out of our parents' house. I was in my 3rd year of college and tired of living under their roof, even if they were great about letting me do my own thing. I wanted my own space, a place to focus on school without the distractions of noisy roommates or overcrowded dorms. Graham had his reasons too. He had just broken up with his girlfriend of 2 years, and not on good terms. She'd been texting another guy, planning to meet up with him when Graham was at work. Graham found the messages, confronted her, and ended things on the spot. He was done with her and ready to move out of their shared apartment. So when I floated the idea of us renting a place together, it made sense. Graham was responsible, quiet, and reliable. The perfect roommate. He worked nights at some high-tech robotics lab, which meant I'd have the house to myself most evenings to study. The hardest part was finding a place. I dove into the search headfirst, trawling through every corner of the internet, from big-name rental sites to obscure message boards. The first few nights I stayed up until my eyes burned, scrolling through listings that all seemed to blur together. Most of them were the same story: cramped one-bedrooms, run-down places with peeling paint, or homes priced so far out of reach they may as well have been castles in the sky. As the days wore on, I started broadening my search, poking around on less reputable sites. The kind where you're just as likely to find a scam as a rental. It was desperation, pure and simple. Then I saw it. The listing practically jumped off the screen. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, an attached 2-car garage, and even a detached garage with a lofted barn. It was on a quiet little street that looked like it had been plucked from a postcard. The price? 1/3 of what similar houses in the area were going for. I clicked through the pictures, my heart racing. Everything about the place looked immaculate. Fresh paint, polished hardwood floors, modern bathrooms, and a gourmet kitchen with stainless steel appliances. It was the kind of house you dreamed about. Spacious, clean, and new. I barely made it through the description before I shot the listing over to Graham. When I showed it to him in person later that evening, my excitement was impossible to hide. "Look at this place," I said, practically shoving my laptop into his hands. He scrolled through the listing, his brow furrowing. "Why's it so cheap?" he asked, the skepticism in his voice impossible to miss. "A house like this should cost twice that. Something's got to be wrong with it." I waved him off, unwilling to let his doubt kill the high. "Sometimes people just price things low to rent them out fast. You're looking a gift horse in the mouth." Graham didn't look convinced. He studied the listing like he was waiting for it to sprout horns. "It's perfect," I said, pressing the point. "If we don't jump on this now, someone else will. Do you want to keep scrolling through overpriced shoeboxes, or do you want to live like kings?" He sighed and muttered something under his breath about it sounding too good to be true. But after 2 solid days of me pestering him, he caved. It wasn't the first time Graham gave in to one of my ideas, and like always, I figured it would turn out fine. I called the number on the listing. It rang several times, each passing second making me think no one was going to pick up. But then, finally, there was a click. "Yes?" The voice was soft, calm, almost too quiet. Not a "hello," not a "this is so-and-so," just yes. Hi," I said, caught a little off guard. "I'm calling about the house for rent. Is it still available?" There was a pause. Not the polite, thoughtful kind, but a long, heavy silence that felt like a dropped call. Just as I was about to ask again, she answered, "Yes, it is." Her voice had a strange quality to it, as though it came from a room too empty or too far away. "Great," I said, trying to push the uneasiness aside. "My brother and I are interested in renting it. What do we need to do to get started?" I kept my voice upbeat, hiding the mix of nervous energy and excitement I felt. "First," she said, "let me outline the rules." There was no warmth in her tone, no small talk, just business. Her words came out flat, almost mechanical, as if she were reciting something she'd memorized long ago. "The rent is as listed. It is due on the 3rd of each month. The security deposit is equal to the rent and will be due with the first payment. Cash only." "Cash?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," she said curtly, offering no explanation. "No pets, no smoking, no drugs on the property, and no children." Her voice hardened at that last part. I blinked. "No children?" "Correct," she said. "Children are not allowed on the property, ever, not even to visit. That is a strict rule. Do you understand?" The weight in her voice made my stomach tighten. They felt heavy, her tone unnervingly firm, like she was laying down a law, not a policy. "Yes," I said, trying to shake off the strangeness. "No kids?" "Not even visiting." "Got it." "Good," she said, and just like that she moved on. "Provide your email address and I'll send over the leasing application. You'll need to include scanned copies of both your IDs when you return it." I gave her my email, and a few moments later, the application hit my inbox. The sender was an attorney's office with a generic name, the kind that didn't stick in your memory. "Once your application is processed," she said, her voice still flat, "you'll receive instructions." Then she ended the call without a goodbye. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone. The conversation had left a sour taste in my mouth, but I didn't want to overthink it. Maybe she was just one of those no-nonsense landlords. Graham was already skeptical about the price, and the last thing I wanted was to spook him with how weird the call had been. I filled out the application, scanned our IDs, and emailed everything back. 30 minutes later, my phone dinged with a reply. "Application approved," the email read. Attached was a DocuSign link to the lease. I didn't hesitate. I clicked the link, read over the lease quickly, too quickly if I'm honest, and signed my name. A second email came through almost immediately. It was short and blunt, just like the call. "Leave the first month's rent and security deposit in the mailbox. The keys will be there for you the following day. You may move in at any time after that. All rent payments are to be left in the mailbox by 12:01 a.m. on the 3rd of each month." I stared at the message, my excitement battling with the growing sense that something about this whole arrangement was off. But the house was perfect, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. The next night, I drove over, and while the street looked pretty nice, the whole process felt odd. Leaving so much cash in a mailbox was strange, but the excitement of moving in overshadowed any uneasiness. The house was ours now, and I told myself nothing else mattered. Early the next morning, Graham and I drove back to find the keys waiting for us in the mailbox, just like she'd said. With the help of some friends, we moved in that weekend. The house was incredible, better than we'd even expected. A massive kitchen with stainless steel appliances, large rooms with bright windows, and plenty of space for both of us. Our friends were all envious, and for a while things felt almost too good to be true. The first few weeks were normal. Graham and I settled into a routine pretty quickly. Me with my classes during the day and long study sessions in the evenings. Graham working his late shifts at the robotics lab while sleeping during the day while I was at class. We'd have quick meals together whenever we could, but for the most part, I had the house to myself at night. The 3rd of the next month came fast. Graham and I had agreed the whole cash in the mailbox thing was weird, but we chalked it up to an eccentric landlord, It was a small price to pay for cheap rent in a house this nice. Still, when the time came to drop the envelope in the box, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong. Something about leaving that much cash out there overnight didn't sit well with me. But we didn't have much choice. I waited until just before midnight, slipped the envelope into the mailbox, and made my way back inside. By then, Graham was already at work. I tried distracting myself with Netflix and a beer, but as the hours ticked by, my nerves got the better of me. At some point, I found myself pacing the living room, glancing out the window like a paranoid idiot. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., I saw the headlights. The car rolled down the street slowly, its engine humming softly against the silence of the neighborhood. It was a black SUV, sleek and unremarkable. The windows were tinted and it stopped right in front of our mailbox. I ducked down by the window, my breath catching as I peered out. The driver's window slid down, and an arm reached out. Long and pale, with fingers that moved unnaturally like they were jointed wrong. The hand slipped into the mailbox, pulling out the envelope with a strange precision, as if the arm didn't belong to the person inside. I froze, watching. For a moment, the arm lingered, the fingers brushing the edge of the mailbox almost thoughtfully. Then it retracted, disappearing into the SUV. The window rolled up, and the car sat there, idling in the darkness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out to find an email. Subject, payment received. I didn't even open it. When I looked back up, the SUV was gone, its taillights vanishing into the night. For a long time, I stayed crouched by the window, trying to convince myself it wasn't that weird. So what if the landlord had a strange way of collecting rent? At least they weren't late. But something about the way that arm moved stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't entirely human. One evening, about a week later, I was digging through the fridge for a snack, and I just happened to look out the kitchen window. An odd feeling came over me as I observed the neighborhood. The street was cloaked in an eerie quiet. None of the other houses had their lights on, not even a porch light. Just street lamps casting pools of light on empty driveways, glinting off darkened windows. I felt a little chill, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just a slow night for the neighborhood. I reheated some leftovers and went back to my assignment, figuring the quiet would help me power through. I was in the middle of typing when I reached for my beer and caught a glimpse of the TV's reflection. I froze. In the screen, I saw a tall figure standing behind me, motionless. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind me. The air felt thick, heavy, but there was nothing. The room was empty, silent. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, searching for an explanation, but all I saw was stillness. I turned back to the TV. The figure was still there. Only now, it was closer. A cold knot of fear twisted in my gut. I whipped around again, my breath hitching, sure that this time, I'd catch it. But the room was the same. Quiet. Empty. My skin prickled as I scanned the space, taking in every flicker of shadow, every angle of furniture. Nothing made sense. The reflection shouldn't have been there. There was nothing, no one, to cause it. My chest tightened as the panic swelled. If I turned back to that screen and saw the figure again, still closer, I was done. I'd grab my keys, bolt out the front door, and not look back. Slowly, I turned my head toward the TV, every nerve in my body screaming against it. The screen stared back, blank and black. The figure was gone. I let out a sharp, shaky breath, sinking back into the couch. But the relief didn't last. My chest stayed tight, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I couldn't shake the feeling, like the room itself was holding its breath, watching me, I stayed like that for minutes, listening to the hum of silence, my heart pounding against the stillness. Gradually, the weight pressing down on me eased, but it never fully left. Something was off. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Pushing the unease aside, I focused back on my paper. But the feeling stuck with me, like something unseen had settled into the room, watching. Every creak of the house made my nerves jolt. Every shadow in my peripheral vision sent my head snapping around. The only thing keeping me grounded was reminding myself I was alone. Graham was at work, and no one else had a key. That night, I went to bed early, thinking some sleep would help. I was dead asleep when I woke with a start, my body jolting upright before my brain had caught up. The room was dark, too dark, and the air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. Breathing. It wasn't mine. It was faint and shallow, coming from the other side of my door. I froze, listening. The breaths came slow and deliberate, with just enough of a rasp to make my skin crawl. And then, beneath it, something else. A soft hissing whisper, words too faint to understand. I stared at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. It was shut, the way I always left it at night. But that didn't feel like enough anymore. The breathing grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there, was leaning closer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and the metal felt icy against my palm. With a soft click, I turned the knob and eased the door open just a crack. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and still, lit faintly by the moonlight spilling in from a distant window. It looked empty, but it didn't feel empty. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt thick, charged, like something was waiting. Then, without warning, it happened. A massive black shadow burst into view, streaking down the hallway. It was impossibly tall, its shape distorted and unnatural, and its footsteps, God. Its footsteps boomed against the floor like thunder. Each step sent vibrations through the walls, through the floor, through me. I staggered back, clutching the edge of the doorframe as I watched the shadow barrel toward the stairs. The booming footsteps grew faster, heavier, each one echoing in my skull. It reached the staircase and thundered down, the sound of it like a hammer driving nails into the silence of the house. I couldn't move. My hand gripped the doorknob, my body frozen in the doorway as the footsteps hit the bottom of the stairs. Then came the creak of the basement door. It opened slowly, the sound cutting through the air like a rusty blade. And then, slam. The door shut with such force that the whole house seemed to shudder. For a long moment, the silence returned. No whispers, no breathing, no booming footsteps. Just me, standing in the doorway, my heart trying to claw its way out of my chest. I didn't know what was worse, the noise or the crushing quiet that followed. I backed into my room, closing the door softly, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Whatever was in the house with me, it was something I couldn't explain. At least, not yet. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, waiting for something else to happen. My ears strained against the silence, desperate for any sound that might tell me where it had gone, or worse, if it was coming back. But the house stayed still. My legs felt like jelly as I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. The faint glow from my phone on the nightstand caught my attention, and I lunged for it, fumbling to unlock the screen. The light felt like a lifeline in the suffocating dark. "Get it together, Parker," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded foreign, thin and shaky. I couldn't stay in my room, not when the thing had gone into the basement. I grabbed the bat from beside my bed, heavy aluminum, cold to the touch, and opened the door again. The hallway was the same as before, empty, silent, but the air felt different now, thicker, like it was harder to breathe. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way down, each step an act of will. My flashlight jittered in my shaky grip as I swept it across the living room. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, but nothing moved. Then my eyes landed on the basement door. It was closed, just as I'd heard it slam. Something about it felt wrong. The wood seemed darker, the edges sharper, like the door was something alive, waiting for me to come closer. I tightened my grip on the bat. My instincts screamed to turn around, go back upstairs, lock myself in my room. But I couldn't just leave it like this. I reached the door and paused, my free hand hovering over the handle. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. It felt colder here, the air tinged with a faint, metallic smell, like blood. With a deep breath, I gripped the knob and turned it. The basement stairs stretched downward into darkness. The flashlight's beam swallowed whole before it even reached the bottom. The smell grew stronger, sulfur mixed with decay. My pulse roared in my ears as I started down, the bat held tight in my other hand. The steps groaned under my weight, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence. I kept my light trained ahead, expecting the shadow to come charging up at me. But there was nothing, just the faint, echoing drip of water somewhere below. When I reached the bottom, I stopped, scanning the space. The basement was as ordinary as ever. Dusty shelves, a stack of old boxes, a workbench littered with tools. But the air felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching me. Hello? My voice cracked as it left my throat. It felt ridiculous even as I said it, but I needed to fill the silence with something. No response. I moved further in, checking each corner, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The boxes looked untouched, the tools undisturbed. But as I passed the workbench, I felt something shift. It wasn't a noise or a movement, more like a change in the air, like a silent ripple. I spun around, swinging the flashlight toward the stairs. Nothing. Then I heard it. A faint creak from above. Something was moving upstairs. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. I scrambled back up the stairs two at a time, gripping the bat like it was my only lifeline. When I reached the kitchen, I froze, every muscle locking in place. The air was charged, the silence deafening. The shadows seemed to pulse, growing and receding like a living thing. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me from the hallway. I raised the bat, backing toward the front door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. The house went silent again, but this time, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the calm before a storm. I gripped the doorknob behind me, ready to throw it open and bolt. But something stopped me, something primal, telling me not to turn my back on whatever was in the house with me. And then, the whispers started again. They were faint at first, like they were coming from inside the walls, but they grew louder, circling me, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. Parker. My name. It was in the whispers. Parker. This time louder, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped the door open and stumbled outside, gulping in the cool night air. The whispers didn't follow me, but the memory of them clung to my skin, icy and sharp. I turned back to the house, half expecting to see something watching me from one of the windows. But the windows were dark, and the house stood still, a silent predator waiting for me to come back inside. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked at the edge of the driveway with the engine running. The headlights carved shallow beams into the dark, barely illuminating the house. Every few minutes I'd glance up at the windows, expecting to see movement. A flicker of a shadow, a face pressed against the glass. But the house stayed quiet. When the sky finally lightened to a pale gray, I turned the engine off and sat in the silence, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. I couldn't keep this up. I couldn't live in a house that felt like it was trying to swallow me whole. Graham needed to hear about this. Graham didn't get home from work until just after 8. When he pulled into the driveway, I was waiting on the front steps, my bat propped up beside me. He climbed out of the truck, looking as tired as ever, and gave me a nod. "You're up early," he said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Something happen?" I gestured to the bat. "We need to talk." Graham froze, his brow furrowing. "All right," he said, a note of caution creeping into his voice. Once we were inside, I told him everything. The whispers, the shadow, the footsteps, the basement door. He listened quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long sigh. "You've been under a lot of stress, Parker. Classes, moving into a new place." "It wasn't stress," I cut in, my voice sharp. "I know what I saw, Graham, what I heard." He held up a hand. "I'm not saying you're crazy. I'm just saying maybe it's not what you think. Old houses make noises. Shadows play tricks on your eyes." "You don't get it," I snapped, frustration bubbling over. "You're never here, Graham. You're always at work. If you were here more, you'd—" "Fine," he said, cutting me off. "I've got some time off coming up. I'll stay home. If this house is as weird as you say, I'll see it for myself." The next week, Graham made good on his promise. He stayed home during his nights off, and at first, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. But then, on the third night, something happened. It was just after 3 a.m., and Graham and I were sitting in the living room. I'd convinced him to stay up late to witness the rent pickup for himself. He was skeptical, but he agreed to humor me. At exactly 3, the headlights appeared. We both went to the window, crouching low to stay out of sight. The black SUV pulled up to the mailbox, just like I'd told him. Graham leaned forward, squinting. "That's the landlord?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I've never seen them get out." The window rolled down and the long, pale arm emerged, moving unnaturally as it reached into the mailbox. Graham stiffened beside me. "What the hell is wrong with their arm?" he muttered. The envelope was pulled inside the SUV, and for a moment, the vehicle just sat there, engine idling. Then the arm retreated, and the window rolled up. My phone buzzed. I checked the screen. "It's the receipt," I said. The SUV drove off without another sound, its taillights disappearing into the night. Graham didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he let out a shaky laugh. "Okay," he said. "That's creepy as hell." We both went to bed after that, exhausted from waiting for the rent pickup. I woke to the feeling of someone tapping my leg. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to make sense of it. The room was pitch black and freezing, the kind of cold that clings to your skin. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Why would Graham be in my room, tapping my leg but not saying anything? The thought barely registered when I felt it. The mattress dipped near my feet. I froze. The weight wasn't light or fleeting. It was deliberate, steady, as though someone had settled at the edge of the bed. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered in my chest. I lay on my side, my back to the door, too afraid to turn and look. The air seemed to grow colder, thicker, pressing down on me. And then I heard it. Soft, shallow breaths coming from the foot of the bed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to stay silent. But the weight shifted again. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted, the pressure fading as if someone were standing up. I stayed frozen as faint footsteps padded across the room. They stopped by the door, and the breathing fell silent as the hinges creaked open. Finally, I mustered the courage to roll over, just in time to glimpse a tall, dark figure disappearing into the hallway. It wasn't a shadow this time. It moved like a person, heavy and deliberate, with loud, booming footsteps that echoed down the hall. "Hey!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me as I bolted out of bed. I ran into the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The figure was already halfway down the stairs, moving impossibly fast. Each step it took reverberated through the house like thunder. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, it was at the bottom, turning the corner toward the front door. I followed, my heart racing, every nerve in my body on edge. The front door creaked open, then slammed shut before I could reach it. I threw it open, stepping into the cold night air, the chill biting at my skin. My breath came in short, visible puffs as I scanned the driveway. At first, there was nothing. The driveway was empty, the detached garage looming in the distance like a shadowed sentinel. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking faintly. Then I saw them. Two glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness behind the garage. They hovered 8 feet above the ground, motionless, their eerie light cutting through the black like tiny embers. I froze, my chest tightening. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the longer I looked, the clearer they became. The rest of the figure was hidden in the shadows, but those eyes, they were all too real. The air around me grew colder, and I realized I wasn't breathing. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the eyes blinked, slow and deliberate, and I felt my stomach drop. A loud crash came from the direction of the house, breaking the spell. I turned instinctively, my heart lurching in my chest. "Parker!" Graham's voice called from somewhere inside, sharp and panicked. I turned back toward the garage, but the eyes were gone. The night seemed darker now, the silence heavier. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me. Graham was standing in the kitchen, his face pale, his brow furrowed. "What the hell's going on?" he demanded. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "There was something out there," I stammered. Graham glanced past me toward the door, his jaw tightening. "You're sure?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I sank into a chair, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. We didn't say much as we sat in the kitchen, both of us nursing mugs of coffee we didn't really want. "You sure it wasn't a dream?" Graham asked finally, his voice low. I shook my head. "It wasn't a dream. I saw it. It looked like a person, but not." Graham didn't respond. He just stared into his coffee, his jaw tight. We sat there until the first light of dawn crept through the windows, neither of us saying another word. There would be no sleep for me. My nerves were frayed for a solid week after that. Things seemed to be intensifying. A week later, I stepped out of the bathroom after a shower. It had been a long day. I'd come home late from class and was ready to relax. I had just pulled on my sweatpants when I heard Graham calling my name from downstairs. "Parker, come here." "Hold on," I shouted back, fumbling to put on my shirt. I didn't rush, though I could hear the edge in his tone. Graham wasn't usually the impatient type, so whatever it was must have been important. As I threw on my socks, he called again, louder this time. "Parker, hurry up." All right, I muttered under my breath, heading down the stairs. The living room was empty. "Graham?" I called out, glancing toward the kitchen. Nothing. The house was still, almost unnaturally so. Then I noticed the basement door. It was open, light spilling onto the floor at the top of the stairs. "I'm down here!" Graham's voice called out from the basement. I hesitated, the unease prickling at the back of my neck. "What are you doing down there?" "Just come on." The frustration in his voice spurred me forward. I gripped the railing as I started down the stairs, the faint smell of damp wood and something metallic hitting me halfway down. "Graham?" I called again. "Back here," his voice replied, coming from the far corner near the storage room. The air grew colder as I reached the bottom, the light overhead flickering faintly. The basement felt wrong, heavy. My steps echoed as I moved toward the corner, glancing nervously at the stacks of boxes and shelves. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to pinpoint his voice. "Here," he said from just behind the storage room door. I turned the corner, and right away, all of the lights in the basement went out. A second later, something slammed into my chest with the force of a freight train, sending me flying backward. My head struck the cement floor, a blinding pain exploding behind my eyes. Everything went hazy after that. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, the world around me was spinning. My head throbbed, and the metallic taste of blood lingered in my mouth. My ears rang, drowning out any sound except for my own labored breathing. For a few moments, I couldn't move. The weight of disorientation pinned me to the floor, and I stared up at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had just happened. Then I remembered. Graham. The shove. The fall. Groaning, I rolled onto my side, the room tilting violently as I pushed myself up onto shaky hands and knees. The cold cement bit into my palms, grounding me just enough to fight the nausea clawing at my stomach. "Graham," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't see the storage room anymore. My vision was a blur, the edges of the basement dissolving into darkness. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, the metallic tang stronger now, like rust and sulfur. I crawled toward the stairs, each movement slow and agonizing. My knees scraped against the cement and my hands fumbled in the dark as a presence surrounded me. "Graham," I called again, louder this time. A faint whisper rippled through the air, too quiet to understand, but unmistakably there. My skin crawled as I forced myself upright, gripping the edge of a shelf for balance. The stairs were just ahead, blurry and impossibly far. I stumbled toward them, each step like dragging my legs through wet cement. My head swam, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but I kept going. The whispers grew louder, circling me, wrapping around my mind like invisible hands. By the time I reached the stairs, I was gasping for breath. The edges of my vision darkened, my balance faltering as I clung to the railing. I banged weakly on the basement door, my fist barely making a sound. "Graham!" Nothing. The whispers surged louder, like a tide crashing against the inside of my skull. I slammed my hand against the door with every ounce of strength I had left. "Graham, open the door!" The sound of footsteps echoed above me, and I sagged against the door in relief. It creaked open, and Graham stood on the other side, his face pale. "Parker?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "What the hell are you doing down there?" I tried to answer, but my words slurred, the world spinning around me. I stumbled forward and Graham caught me, steadying me as I clung to his arm. Graham helped me to the couch, his grip firm but his face pale, I sank into the cushions, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Stay here," Graham said, his voice tight. He disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a glass of water, setting it on the coffee table in front of me. "What the hell were you doing down there?" I stared at him, struggling to find the words. "You called me," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I thought you needed help." Graham's brow furrowed, his confusion obvious. "Parker, I didn't call you. I've been in the garage all night working on the carburetor. I just came in what, an hour ago?" "No," I insisted, shaking my head. "You called for me, over and over. You said you were in the basement. I went down there and..." I stopped, the memory of the shadow and the shove hitting me like a wave. Graham rubbed the back of his neck, his frown deepening. "Parker, when I came inside, you yelled down to me. Said you were going to bed. I heard your door close and everything." The room spun again, but not from the blow to my head. My mouth went dry and I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. I never said that," I whispered. "I was in my room. I heard you call me, and..." Graham raised a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "Look, I'm not messing with you, all right? You yelled something about going to bed and I figured you were turning in early. I watched TV for a bit, and just went to bed, like 15 minutes ago. I thought you were in your room. Your door was closed." His words sent a chill down my spine, icy and sharp. If Graham hadn't called me, the memory of the shove hit me again. The weight of it, the force. My head throbbed, but the ache in my chest, the fear, was worse. The basement door loomed in my mind, that faint metallic smell still clinging to the back of my throat. My hands started to shake, and I gripped the edge of the couch, forcing myself to stay steady. "Something's wrong with this house, Graham," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Graham didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at me like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, he leaned back in the chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "We'll figure it out," he said, but his voice was anything but confident. We didn't say much after that. The silence between us felt like a third presence in the room, heavy and watching. Graham went upstairs eventually, and I stayed on the couch, staring at the walls until the first rays of sunlight started creeping through the windows. After that night, I avoided being home as much as possible, especially home alone. It wasn't always possible, but I minimized my time in the house. Being there alone at night felt like standing on the edge of something too deep and dark to see the bottom. The library on campus became my sanctuary. It was peaceful and quiet. Most importantly, it didn't have freaky things happening that made me question my sanity. After everything that had been happening in the house, the whispers, the shadows, the things I couldn't explain, the library was my safe haven. That's how I met Julia. She sat at a table a few rows over, her laptop open and a pair of headphones hanging loosely around her neck. We shared a few classes, but we'd never really talked. She always seemed focused, her gaze locked on her screen as she typed furiously or flipped through a mountain of notes. One night, I couldn't focus on my paper. The silence of the library was starting to feel too much like the silence of the house. Heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting just behind it. I found myself glancing at Julia, partly out of distraction, partly because she seemed so calm and normal, the complete opposite of what I'd been feeling. When she looked up and caught me staring, I thought I'd blown it. But instead of being annoyed, she smiled faintly. "Long night?" she asked, pulling her headphones off. "You could say that?" I replied, a little embarrassed. Trying to get through this paper, but my brain's not cooperating. "Tell me about it," she said, nodding toward her stack of textbooks. "This roommate drama's been messing with my focus all week. The library is the only place I can actually get work done." I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I know the feeling. Sometimes you just need to get out of the house." She smiled again, and somehow we ended up talking. Nothing deep, just complaining about classes and deadlines, trading stories about the quirks of dorm life. But it was easy, natural. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. Over the next few days, we started running into each other more often. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but eventually we started meeting up on purpose. We'd sit at the same table working quietly until one of us hit a wall and needed to vent or joke around. I didn't tell her about the house. Not at first. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. I just didn't want to sound crazy. How do you explain shadows that run down hallways, whispers that come out of nowhere, and footsteps that lead to close basement doors? But even without telling her, I felt better just having her around. One night, after we'd been working side by side for hours, Julia sighed and closed her laptop. "I'm officially giving up for the night," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Big move," I teased. "What's the occasion?" "My roommate," she said, rolling her eyes. "I can't deal with her anymore. She had her boyfriend over again last night and they were not quiet. I'm this close to moving out." I hesitated, a thought forming before I could stop it. "You know," I said slowly, "I've got a spare room at my place." Her eyes lit up. "Are you serious? That'd be amazing." I almost said yes right then and there, but something made me stop. The house, the basement, the shadows. "There's something you should know first," I said, my voice hesitant. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "It's nothing bad, just unusual. The house, it's weird." She tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "Weird how?" I hesitated again, then told her everything. The cheap rent, the shadow in the hallway, the whispers at night, the basement. I expected her to laugh, or maybe look at me like I'd lost my mind. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "So you think it's haunted?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But something's not right." A slow grin spread across her face. "Haunted house? Even better. When can I move in?" I blinked. "You're not freaked out?" "Are you kidding? I love this stuff." I wasn't sure how to feel about her enthusiasm, but I didn't have the energy to argue. I told her I'd have to talk to Graham first, but if he was okay with it, she could move in by the weekend. Graham was less enthusiastic. "You really think it's a good idea to bring someone else into this mess?" he asked when I told him. "I don't see how it could hurt," I said. And I told her everything. She knows what she's getting into. He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. Just don't blame me if she bails after the first week." Julia moved in a few days later, taking the bedroom at the end of the hall. She was fun and easygoing, a breath of fresh air in a house that had been feeling darker and heavier by the day. For a little while, it felt like she brought the place to life. The shadows stopped moving. The whispers faded. Even the basement seemed quieter. It was good having her around. She'd always been easy to talk to back in the library, and now that she lived with us, she brought a sense of normalcy to the house. She'd sit at the kitchen island with her laptop, working on projects and keeping me company while I made dinner or studied. For a little while, it felt like everything might actually be okay. But good things never last. It started small. Julia would leave a mug on the counter, only to find it moved to the other side of the kitchen when she came back. Her notebook disappeared from the living room one afternoon, reappearing in the hallway upstairs. She thought it was Graham or me playing a prank, but when she mentioned it, we both just shook our heads. "That's weird," Graham said, frowning. "Stuff's been moving around for me too." "You think it's the ghost?" Julia asked with a half smile. I could tell she was joking, but I didn't laugh. "Maybe," I said quietly. She gave me a strange look, but didn't press it. One night I came home late from class to find Julia in the living room, curled up on the couch with her laptop. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag by the door. "Burning the midnight oil?" She glanced up and smiled. "Something like that. I couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd get some work done." Her smile faded as she looked past me, her expression growing tense. "Did you just come downstairs?" she asked, her voice cautious. I frowned. "Nope. I just got home. Why?" She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "I thought I heard someone walking around up there a few minutes ago. Heavy footsteps." A chill ran down my spine. "It was probably the house settling," I said quickly, trying to reassure her. She didn't look convinced. The next morning, Julia seemed quieter than usual. "You okay?" I asked as we sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, had a weird night." Graham came downstairs a moment later, yawning and scratching his head. He grabbed a cup of coffee and joined us at the table, his expression unusually serious. "All right," he said, looking between us. "I need to ask, are either of you messing with me?" Julia and I exchanged a glance. "Messing with you how?" I asked. Graham rubbed his temple, clearly frustrated. "Stuff keeps moving. My phone was on my nightstand last night, and when I woke up, it was on the bathroom counter. I didn't put it there." "Yeah, and my notebook disappeared from the kitchen island yesterday," Julia added, her voice quiet. "I found it in my room this morning." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's not us," I said. "I told you before, this house is weird." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You really think it's haunted?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But something's definitely not right." Graham leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Whatever it is, it's getting worse." A week later, I was arriving home late, after my last class that day. The street was its usual eerie self. Dark, still, and dead quiet. Not a single light in any of the neighboring houses. Julia's car was in the driveway, parked right where she always left it. I hopped out of my car and climbed the steps to the front door, letting myself in. The air inside was heavy, colder than usual. "Julia?" I called, closing the door behind me. My voice echoed through the house, but there was no response. The kitchen lights were off. The living room was empty. I set my bag down and headed upstairs, calling her name again. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the bathroom door was closed, and the faint sound of running water drifted out from behind it. "Julia?" I said, knocking lightly. "You all right?" "Yeah," her voice called back, muffled by the door and the steady hum of the shower. "I'll be out soon." Her tone sounded normal enough, but something about it still made me hesitate. "All right," I said, shaking my head. "I'll grab a sandwich or something." I headed downstairs and started rummaging through the fridge, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. After a few minutes, I heard the bathroom door open and Julia's voice calling down to me. "I'm done," she said. I'm gonna head to bed. Good night." "Good night," I called back, hearing her footsteps retreat toward her room. The tension in my chest eased a little. I grabbed my sandwich and moved to the living room, collapsing onto the couch with a sigh. That's when I noticed the basement door. The latch was locked. I frowned, setting my plate down on the coffee table. We never latched that door. Not once since we'd moved in. My stomach twisted as I walked over to it, my hand hovering over the latch. "You're overthinking this," I muttered to myself, sliding the lock free. The door creaked open, revealing the black void of the basement stairs. I reached for the light switch, flipping it, but nothing happened. "Great," I mumbled, leaning forward to peer into the darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, wild footsteps, pounding up the stairs, fast and uneven. My heart lurched as the sound grew louder, closer, like whatever was down there was charging straight at me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Before I could react, Julia burst out of the darkness, nearly knocking me over as she collapsed into my arms. Her body shook with violent sobs, her hands clutching my shirt like a lifeline. "Julia!" I gasped, trying to steady her. What the hell were you doing down there?" She didn't answer at first, her breathing ragged and uneven. Tears streaked her face, her eyes wide with terror. "It wasn't you!" she finally choked out, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, still trying to catch my breath. She looked up at me, her expression raw with fear. "It wasn't you," she repeated. "I thought it was you. I heard your voice calling me, telling me to come downstairs." My blood ran cold. "I wasn't here," I said slowly. "I just got home." Julia shook her head, her grip tightening on my shirt. "I heard you, Parker. You called me. You said you needed my help with something in the basement. I thought it was weird, because your car wasn't in the driveway, but it sounded like you." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I went down there and the lights went out. Something grabbed me. Parker. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like it was holding me down." Her words sent a wave of nausea through me. "I didn't get free until you opened the door," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And then I just ran." I pulled her into a tighter hug, my mind racing. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. "You're safe now." I guided her to the couch and grabbed a blanket from the hall closet, wrapping it around her. She sat there trembling as I made some coffee, my own hands shaking as I poured. We stayed up the rest of the night, neither of us willing to let the other out of sight. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a strange noise, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark. The TV was off, and the faint glow of moonlight spilling in through the blinds cast long shadows across the walls. And somehow the basement door was open. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing over Julia. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up slowly, my movements careful and deliberate. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly as if it were studying her. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it turned its head toward me. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and shift as it moved, and for a brief moment, I saw its eyes, piercing and red. Before I could react, it was gone. The figure darted toward the basement, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding as I rushed to the basement door. It slammed shut just as I reached it, the sound echoing through the silent house. "Julia!" I shouted, shaking her awake. She sat up with a gasp, her eyes wide and disoriented. What happened? There was someone, I said, struggling to find the words. They were standing over you. We called the cops, desperate for answers. But when they arrived, they searched the basement. And of course, they didn't find anyone down there. However, when they searched the storage room, their attention was drawn to an unusual sight. In the middle of the floor stood a large wooden box, its surface blanketed in dust and cobwebs, as though it had been undisturbed for years. Surrounding the box, etched into the floor, was a strange symbol. Its jagged lines were sharp and precise, as if meticulously carved into the surface, lending an eerie sense of purpose to its design. The cops didn't know what to make of it. Neither did we. The cops left after a long, frustrating conversation about what they found. They hadn't believed a word about the shadowy figure, but they couldn't deny the symbol and the box in the basement. Still, they chalked it up to weird stuff left by the previous owners, and told us to call if there were any actual intruders. Actual intruders. As if we could explain what was happening in this house to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Julia and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the box the officers had left behind. It was old, heavy-looking wood with a deep patina, like it had been sitting down there for decades. The latch was rusted shut, but the weight of whatever was inside felt ominous. "I don't want this in the house," Julia said, her voice tight. "Neither do I admitted, "but I have to know what's inside." She hesitated, then nodded, pulling her legs up onto the chair as if trying to shield herself. "Fine, but do it fast." I grabbed a screwdriver from the drawer and worked at the latch. It groaned in protest, the rust flaking off in chunks. Finally, with one last shove, it popped open. The smell hit us immediately, a sharp metallic tang mixed with something foul, like rotting meat and damp earth. "God," Julia muttered, covering her nose. "What is that?" I lifted the lid, and the contents sent a cold chill racing down my spine. Inside the box was a collection of objects that looked like they belonged in a witch's lair. There was a dagger with an ornately carved hilt, its blade dark and stained with something that looked disturbingly like old blood. Beside it was a locket containing a lock of red hair, tied with a frayed piece of string. Wrapped in a yellowed linen cloth was something small and oddly shaped. With trembling hands, I unwrapped it, revealing a shriveled, blackened human finger. Julia let out a strangled gasp, pushing her chair back from the table. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Parker, what is this?" I shook my head, unable to speak. My hands moved on their own, carefully pulling the last object from the box. It was a small, leather-bound book, the cover worn, smooth with age. The pages were covered in a strange, spidery script I didn't recognize, but it didn't take long to figure out what it was. The symbols etched into the floor of the basement matched the markings in the book. This is some kind of ritual," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Julia stared at me, her face pale. "You're not keeping that here," she said, her tone sharp. "What do you want me to do with it?" I asked, gesturing at the box. "Throw it back in the basement? It's already part of whatever's happening here." She didn't respond, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I didn't have a better answer, so I closed the box and carried it to the living room. Leaving it on the kitchen table felt wrong, too close to where we ate, where we tried to pretend we were normal people living in a normal house. That night, Julia refused to sleep alone. We camped out on the couch together, the box shoved into the corner of the room like a forgotten time bomb. I woke up to the sound of the front door closing. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long, pale streaks across the living room floor where Julia and I had collapsed sometime during the night. My body ached from the awkward position, and my mind was still foggy from the nightmares that had plagued me through the few hours I'd managed to sleep. Graham was standing in the entryway, his jacket slung over his arm, his face twisted in confusion as he looked at the chaos around him. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, tossing his keys onto the counter. Julia stirred next to me, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples as though the events of the previous night were clawing their way back to her. "Graham," I started, my voice hoarse. "You're not going to believe this." We recounted the night in vivid, painful detail. The shadowy figure, the whispering, the grotesque discoveries in the wooden box. Graham's face shifted from skeptical to alarmed as the story unfolded. You opened the box?" he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Julia nodded, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "We didn't know what else to do." Graham swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "You don't mess with stuff like that, Parker. You put it back. You hear me? You put it back where you found it." His voice was rising, but I couldn't blame him. He wasn't just scared. He was furious. "We can't," I said. "Not until we figure out what it is. It's connected to whatever's happening in this house. If we understand it, maybe we can stop it." Graham shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "Neither of you do. You think you're going to solve some big mystery, but you're just poking the hornet's nest." "I'm not putting it back," Julia said firmly, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "Not until we know more." Graham threw his hands up in frustration. "Fine," he snapped. "Do what you want. Just don't say I didn't warn you." He stomped upstairs, muttering under his breath, and we heard his bedroom door close a moment later. Julia and I sat in silence, the tension between us as heavy as the air in the house. Finally, she stood, brushing herself off. "I'm taking this stuff to my room," she said, gathering the box and its contents. "Be careful," I said. She gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You too." I didn't wake up until late in the afternoon, the light outside already fading into the muted grays of early evening. My stomach growled as I rolled out of bed groggy and disoriented from sleeping so long. The house was quiet, eerily so. I walked down the hall, checking Graham's room. The door was ajar and I could hear the sound of the shower running. "Graham?" I called, but there was no response. He was probably getting ready for work. I continued down the hall and stopped outside Julia's door. That's when I heard it. A voice, low and soft, almost a whisper, speaking from inside her room. My pulse quickened. It wasn't Julia's voice. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words, but they were muffled, indistinct. I knocked gently. "Julia?" The whispering stopped abruptly. A long moment passed, and then the door creaked open slowly, revealing Julia sitting on the edge of her bed. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and the faint glow of her phone cast eerie shadows across her face. "What's up?" she said, her voice light and sing-song like nothing was wrong. I hesitated. "Were you talking to someone?" She tilted her head, giving me a curious look. "No," she said, "just me." I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone else lurking in the shadows. But it was empty. "All right," I said slowly. "Just checking." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Thanks for looking out for me." I left her to it, but the unease lingered as I headed downstairs to make something to eat. I stayed up late that night, flipping aimlessly through channels in the living room. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Eventually, I drifted off, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the walls. I woke to darkness. The TV was off, the room pitch black except for the faint sliver of moonlight seeping through the blinds. At first, I thought the power had gone out, because it was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, everything was silent. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dark. That's when I saw it. The basement door was open. A figure stood in the doorway, its outline faint, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the light switch, flipping it on. The figure vanished instantly, leaving the door ajar. Then I heard it. The creak of footsteps coming up the basement stairs. Each step was slow and deliberate, the sound growing louder with each passing second. My hands shook as I backed toward the kitchen, my eyes glued to the doorway. And then she appeared. Julia. Her face was blank, her eyes empty, as if she were sleepwalking. She walked past me without a word, heading upstairs with slow, mechanical movements. "Julia?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I stayed frozen for a long moment, staring after her. Then, I grabbed my phone and retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. I forced myself to lie down and tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that maybe she was just having a bad night. The usual hum of appliances and creaks of settling wood were gone, replaced by a silence so deep it was oppressive. My ears strained for any sound, but the quiet was complete. I must have dozed off at some point, but when I woke it was instant and jarring. My heart pounded in my chest as I blinked in the dark, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I saw it. The door. It was open. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I scanned the darkness. My door, the one I was positive I had locked before bed, was now wide open. And standing in the hallway, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight, was Julia. Her silhouette made my skin crawl. Her head tilted slightly, her arms hung limply at her sides. I froze. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat like a fist. Julia stepped forward, and her voice sliced through the silence. "Parker, I need you to come to the basement with me." Her voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, layered, distorted, like two voices trying to speak at the same time. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "I just want to show you something I found," she said, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers. It was too wide, too forced, her teeth glinting unnaturally in the dim light. "I think you'll like it." My stomach twisted. Her words were wrong. Deliberate, rehearsed like a recording. It didn't feel like her talking. It felt like something was pulling the strings. "You'll like it. I promise," she said, her voice twisting. Before I could even think of what to do, another voice came from downstairs. "Hey bro, come down here. I need you to see this." Graham's voice. But Graham was at work. I felt the blood drain from my body. My legs felt like lead as I stared at Julia. "Let me get dressed," I muttered, stalling. The wood of the hallway creaked as I stepped out of my room. Julia stood at the top of the stairs, motionless, bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, her arms limp at her sides. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were black, completely black. No whites, no irises. Just endless voids that seemed to pull at the air around them, swirling faintly with a sinister energy. "Come on, Parker," she said softly. Her voice was calm but wrong, layered with that eerie dual tone, like two people speaking at once. "I need you to come to the basement with me." A chill crawled down my spine. but I swallowed hard and managed to whisper, "Why?" Her smile was slow and far too wide. "Because I found something," she said, her voice sing-song yet hollow. "I think you'll like it." Before I could respond, another voice echoed up from the shadows below. "Hey, Parker, come down here. You need to see this." It was a perfect imitation of Graham's voice. So perfect, it almost made me question if it was really Graham. Almost. "Don't make us wait," Graham's voice called again, lighter this time, like we were sharing some inside joke. Julia's head snapped toward the stairs, her movements jerky and puppet-like. She began descending, her feet making no sound on the wooden steps. "Parker," Graham's voice coaxed. Again from below. "It's important." Every muscle in my body screamed for me to turn and run, but I stood frozen, my hand gripping the edge of the railing. I watched as Julia vanished into the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. "Come on, Parker," she called, her voice lilting like a nursery rhyme. "We're waiting." The cold air of the house pressed against me, urging me forward. But I wasn't stupid. This was a trap. Whatever was down there, whatever was wearing Graham's voice and pulling Julia's strings, I wasn't going to play along. I forced myself to move, but not toward the basement. Step by step, I inched toward the front door, keeping my breathing steady, my eyes darting between the stairs and the hallway. The door was only a few feet away now. My fingers brushed the cold brass knob and relief surged through me. That's when I heard her again. "Where are you going, Parker?" Her voice was right behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, and there she was. Julia. Her black eyes glinted like oil, her pale face blank except for that eerie, stretched grin. "I need you to see this," she said, her tone sweet, but dripping with malice. I didn't answer. My hand twisted the knob, and I yanked the door open, the cold night air rushing in. But before I could take a step outside, something latched onto my arm with the strength of a vice. It was Julia. Her grip was inhuman, crushing. Despite being barely 5 feet 1 inch and maybe 100 pounds, she yanked me back like I was nothing, slamming the door shut with her free hand. "Don't go," she said softly, her voice a cruel mockery of concern. "We're not done yet." I tried to pull away, but her fingers dug into my arm, unyielding. Her black eyes stared into mine, bottomless pits that promised something far worse than death. "Get off of me!" I shouted, twisting and yanking against her iron grip. Her smile widened, her head tilting unnaturally. "Come back inside, Parker," she whispered. "It's where you belong." Adrenaline surged through me, and I threw myself backward with all my strength, slipping out of her grasp as my jacket came loose. I hit the ground hard, scrambling to my feet and lunging for the door. Julia didn't follow. She stood in the doorway, her empty black eyes watching me as I tore down the driveway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back as I jumped into my car, slamming the door and locking it in one motion. My hands fumbled with the keys, my heart racing as the engine roared to life. As I peeled out onto the street, tires screeching against the asphalt, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. Julia was there, standing in the driveway. Her expression was calm, her black eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. And then she smiled. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and cloaked in darkness. The rhythmic pounding of my heart filled the car, loud and insistent. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I didn't loosen my hold. My foot stayed pressed to the gas pedal as I sped away from the house, from her, from it. I couldn't shake the image of Julia's black, soulless eyes. That smile. The way she'd stood there, calm as a predator, watching prey scramble. I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner, my tires crunching over the gravel. The glowing neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, and I killed the engine, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I needed Graham. My fingers shook as I typed the message. Don't go home after work. Meet me at the Full Moon Diner as soon as possible. Something happened. I hit send and leaned back in the seat, my breath fogging up the window. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, made me flinch. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, headlights swung into the lot, and Graham's truck rolled to a stop next to me. He stepped out, his expression etched with concern, his work uniform still pristine. Parker, what the hell's going on? After I got your message, I had to leave work early. I got out of the car, still jittery, and waved him inside the diner. Not here, I muttered. Let's go in. Graham didn't argue. The bell above the door chimed softly as we stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and food hit me like a comforting wave. We slid into a booth at the far corner, away from the only other patron, a trucker nursing a plate of eggs, and the waitress brought us coffee without a word. I waited until she walked away before I started. Something's wrong with Julia. Graham frowned, leaning forward. What do you mean? Wrong, like sick? No, not sick, I said, my voice low. Like possessed. Graham's face darkened as I finished recounting everything, his jaw tightening with every word. He sat back in the booth, rubbing his hands over his face like he was trying to wipe away what I'd just told him. Damn it, Parker, he said, his voice low and tense. I told you not to mess with that box. I told you. I flinched at his words, but I couldn't argue. He had told me, more than once. He leaned forward again, his eyes locked onto mine. You realize how serious this is now, don't you? Whatever's happening to Julia, it's because of that thing. And now it's in the house. I nodded, my throat dry. I know. I get it. But it was always in the house. It's just worse now the box is opened. I just didn't think... That's the problem, Graham interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. You didn't think. You should have left that damn box alone. He exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing as he leaned back. But, okay, he said, his voice softer now. What's done is done. We've got to fix this. Somehow. Hearing him say that, hearing him take me seriously, was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. So, you believe me? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Graham gave me a look like I'd just asked if the sky was blue. Of course I believe you. Do you think I'd be sitting here at 4 a.m. if I didn't? This is bad, Parker. Real bad. And it's not going to stop unless we do something about it. His words hit me like a gut punch, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I nodded, my fingers fidgeting with the edge of the coffee cup. First thing, Graham said, his tone shifting to that no-nonsense older brother voice he always used when things got serious. We go back to the house. We figure out what's going on with Julia and see if we can find that box. Whatever's in it might give us a clue. But Parker, his voice trailed off and he gave me a hard look. We don't touch anything else. You hear me? Not one damn thing. I nodded again, this time with more conviction. Got it. Graham sighed and stood, tossing a few bills on the table for the coffee. All right, let's do this. As much as I hated the idea of going back, knowing Graham believed me and had my back made the thought just a little less terrifying. Just a little. Graham and I left the diner, the cold night air hitting like a slap to the face. The street was eerily quiet, as if the world outside had paused to let the darkness we were heading into deepen. I trailed Graham to his truck, my stomach twisting tighter with each step. We arrived back at the house. Graham and I stood for a moment, dreading what was coming next. "You sure about this?" I asked, half hoping he'd reconsider. "Not even a little," he said, unlocking his car. "But what choice do we have?" We entered through the front door. The house was silent as Graham and I entered, our nerves taut like piano wires. The air inside was heavy, carrying that damp, faintly rotten smell that had become almost a background hum to life here. "Julia?" Graham called, his voice low and cautious. No response. We started our search downstairs. The living room was untouched, the kitchen pristine. There was no sign of her anywhere. Graham moved toward the basement door, but it was locked. "She wouldn't go down there, would she?" he asked, his hand resting on the knob. "She might have," I muttered, though I didn't believe it myself. Graham slid the latch aside and pushed the basement door open. I hurried to the kitchen drawer, grabbing 2 flashlights. We exchanged a final look, each of us silently hoping the other might call it off. But there was no hesitation in our eyes. Neither of us was going to back down. We turned on the flashlights and aimed the beams down the stairs. Slowly, we descended. At the bottom, we swept the room with our lights, scanning every corner. Nothing. Finally, we approached the storage room door. It was wide open. Inside, the room was completely empty. We stood there, motionless, staring at the ominous symbol etched into the floor, its presence twisting the air around it. Feeling a grim sense of accomplishment, we turned and headed back upstairs to the first floor. The rest of the downstairs yielded nothing, so we headed upstairs. Julia's door was wide open, but the room was empty. Her bed was unmade, her belongings scattered as if she'd left in a hurry. "The box," I said suddenly, a chill running through me. I stepped into her room and scanned the floor where we had last seen it. The box and everything inside it were gone. "Damn it," Graham hissed, stepping in beside me. "She took it. She did something with it. Why would she do that?" My voice cracked. "I don't know. But this is bad. Really bad," Graham said, running a hand through his hair. His face was pale, and I could see the same dread I felt mirrored in his eyes. We went through the rest of the upstairs, even checking closets and under beds, but there was no trace of Julia. "What now?" I asked as we returned to the hallway. Graham looked at me grimly. "Call her." I dialed her number, the familiar tone ringing in my ear. Voicemail. I tried again. Still nothing. We debated calling the police that night, but something about the situation felt too strange to explain. Instead, we decided to wait until morning. Maybe she'd turn up. Maybe we'd get answers. But she didn't. The next day passed with no word from Julia. Her car stayed in the driveway, her phone went straight to voicemail, and her parents insisted they had spoken to her and that she was fine. 3 days passed and still nothing. The police wouldn't take a missing person report seriously since her parents claimed she wasn't missing. Graham and I were left stewing in our growing paranoia, unable to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Then, the storm came. A series of brutal storms battered the area over the course of 3 days. The storms knocked out power and left many roads impassable due to downed trees and power lines. The house, now plunged into darkness, felt more oppressive than ever. With Graham unable to get to work, we spent the days stuck inside, trying to keep our minds occupied. But the house wouldn't let us forget. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the walls, felt like it was whispering Julia's name. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Graham and I sat in the dim glow of a flashlight, talking to distract ourselves. "You ever notice," Graham began, his voice hushed, "that we've never seen any neighbors? Not once. No lights, no cars, nothing." I frowned, thinking about it. I guess I didn't really pay attention, but now that you mention it, yeah, it's weird. Weird doesn't cover it. Graham pulled out his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. "I did some digging earlier. Every house on this street is owned by the same LLC. Every single one." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means this whole setup is rotten," Graham said, his voice low and angry. "The rent, the empty neighborhood, the creepy landlord, it's all connected." The storm continued to howl outside as the implications sank in. This house, this street, it was all part of something much bigger, something we didn't understand. That night, we each went to our rooms early. The lack of power and the oppressive atmosphere made it impossible to relax. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by strange, surreal nightmares I couldn't wake from. When I finally did wake up, I wasn't alone. I couldn't move. Something was pinning me to the bed. Hands, I realized. Cold, firm hands holding my shoulders, my legs, my arms. My chest felt like it was being crushed, the weight unbearable. Panic flared, hot and bright as my eyes darted around the room. And then I saw her. Julia stood in the corner, bathed in the flickering glow of a single candle. Her black eyes reflected nothing, swallowing the light as if it dared not touch her. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, movements stiff and deliberate, like a marionette guided by unseen strings. The shadows at her feet pulsed and stretched, slithering up the walls as though alive. She didn't speak, not to me. Instead, she began to chant. The words were guttural, ancient, scraping against my ears like nails on a chalkboard. The book from the box was clutched in her hands, its cracked spine sagging under the weight of its sinister knowledge. She flipped through the pages as she spoke, her tone rising and falling like a song meant for something far older than language. I tried to scream, to thrash, but I was trapped. I felt the bed dip as she climbed on, kneeling beside me. She reached for my hair, her grip cold and unyielding, and with a quick, precise motion, she sliced off a chunk with the dagger. The strands fell into the flame of the candle, hissing as they burned. Her chanting grew louder. Then came the cuts. The dagger bit into my skin, first across my forehead, then along my arms and chest. They weren't deep, but the pain was sharp, burning as if the blade itself were laced with poison. Blood welled up, pooling along the edges of the intricate patterns she was carving into me. I could feel it dripping, soaking into the sheets beneath me. The flame from the candle flared higher, casting her shadow across the room. And behind her, no, within her shadow, I saw it. The tall figure, its eyes like embers in the dark, loomed over her. It wasn't separate from her. It was part of her, moving as she moved, speaking as she spoke. Her chanting reached a fever pitch. She grabbed my hand, pinning it down with inhuman strength. The dagger hovered over my fingers, her intent clear. She was going to cut them off. "No!" I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. But she didn't stop. The blade descended, slicing into my skin. I felt the first jolt of pain as she began to sever my fingers. Control surged back into my limbs like a flood, and I gasped for air. I rolled off the bed, landing hard on the opposite side. My chest, arms, and face stung as blood oozed from the shallow but numerous cuts Julia had made. The worst damage was to my fingers, but fortunately, she didn't reach the bone. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I forced myself to stand. Across the room, Julia moved like something animated by invisible strings, her black eyes boring into me. She scrambled to her feet with eerie speed, her movements jerky, inhuman. Without a word, she bolted out of the room and down the hallway, her footsteps light but unnervingly fast. Ignoring the pain slicing through my body, I stumbled into the hallway. My priority wasn't Julia. It was Graham. His door was closed. I shoved it open, heart racing, and found him sprawled on his bed, blood soaking the sheets beneath him. He wasn't moving. "Graham!" I yelled, rushing to his side. His eyelids fluttered and his hand shot out, catching me in the ribs with surprising force. Reflex. He groaned, blinking up at me in confusion. "It's me. It's Parker," I said, gripping his shoulders. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by relief. She stabbed me," he croaked. "I know. Come on, we need to get out of here." I helped him sit up, grimacing at the extent of his injuries. Shallow cuts lined his arms, and a nasty gash ran along his side, but he was alive. I hooked his arm over my shoulders and hauled him to his feet. We stumbled out into the hallway together, his weight almost too much for me to bear. The stairs were just ahead. Freedom was so close. That's when I felt the blow. Something heavy struck the back of my head, and I crumpled to the floor. The world spun violently, and my vision blurred as pain radiated through my skull. Dazed, I heard Graham's voice above me, weak but panicked. "Parker, get up." Through my disorientation, I saw her, Julia. She had Graham by the ankle, her small frame dragging his much larger body with terrifying ease. "No," I groaned, forcing myself to crawl toward the stairs. Julia yanked Graham down the hallway, down the stairs, and toward the basement door. Her strength defied logic, her movements fueled by some unholy force. The door creaked open, and she dragged him into the darkness below. Graham screamed, "Parker, help!" I scrambled to my feet, every part of me aching, and charged down the stairs through the kitchen and down the basement stairs. The smell hit me first, a rancid mix of sulfur and decay that made me gag. At the bottom, I could see the basement was filled with burning candles. Julia stood by the storage room door, dragging Graham closer. "Let him go," I shouted, my voice cracking. She turned to face me, her black eyes blazing with hatred. The air around her seemed to warp, shadows curling unnaturally at her feet. I spotted the canoe paddle leaning against the wall and lunged for it. Gripping it tightly, I swung with all my strength. The paddle struck her in the head, the impact jolting my arms. Julia staggered but didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, her head tilting at an unnatural angle, and let out a guttural growl. She stepped toward me, dragging Graham with her free hand. Her gaze was fixed, burning with rage. I swung again, harder this time, the paddle connecting with the side of her skull. She crumpled to her knees, finally releasing Graham. Wasting no time, I dropped the paddle and grabbed my brother, hauling him upright. "Come on!" Julia stirred behind us, her movements jerky as she pushed herself up. I acted on instinct, grabbing her by the shoulders and shoving her into the storage room. She thrashed and screamed, her voice distorted and filled with rage. I slammed the door shut and wedged a chair under the handle. "Go!" I yelled, pulling Graham toward the stairs. We stumbled up the stairs together, Julia's screams echoing from the basement, each shriek clawing at my nerves. At the top, I threw the door shut with a bang and locked it, my hands trembling. Collapsing to the floor beside my brother, I fumbled in my pocket for my phone. The screen was shattered, spiderweb cracks glinting in the dim light, but somehow the call connected. The voice of the 911 operator crackled through the speaker, calm and steady. I let the phone slip from my fingers onto the floor as they asked, "What's the nature of your emergency?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the crash came. She must have freed herself from the storage room. Then we heard her charging up the stairs. Only she sounded like someone 10 times her size. Julia's voice rose into an unearthly howl, and the basement door buckled under the force of her blows. The wood splintered, and the entire frame groaned as if it would give way at any moment. "Let me out," her voice bellowed, no longer human. We clung to each other helpless as the door strained against her onslaught. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. 40 minutes later, the police arrived. We explained what had happened, but the looks on their faces told us they didn't believe a word of it. The officers descended the stairs, their flashlights carving shallow beams into the basement's darkness. Graham and I stayed at the top, every creak of the steps making my stomach twist tighter. "No one's down here," one of the officers called up, but his voice sounded uneasy. "What about the storage room?" I shouted, my throat dry. There was a long pause. "Nothing here, but, hold on." His voice wavered slightly, and I caught the faint rustle of fabric. "There's a smell. Sulfur, maybe? Rot?" Graham looked at me, his face pale. "They're not going to find her," he muttered. "You know that, right?" The officers returned, their expressions grim but confused. "Basement's clear," one said. "Nothing unusual except a faint smell. Could be mold. Might want to get that checked out." My heart sank as I looked past them down into the darkness. When I ventured down myself, it was exactly as they'd said. No blood, no box, no Julia. The shadows clung to the corners like they were laughing at me. Nothing made sense. After paramedics bandaged our wounds, we were taken to the hospital for a full evaluation. Graham's injuries were serious, but they said he would pull through. We spent a few days in the hospital after that night. Graham stayed longer. His stab wounds needed more care. I got out sooner, but the bandaged wounds and the mental weight of what happened lingered. For a time, we stayed with our parents, trying to make sense of it all. The house, Julia, the basement. It felt like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Then, it came. The email hit my inbox late one night, the glow of the screen casting a pale light on my trembling hands. The subject line was succinct, chilling. Final communication. I opened it, my breath catching as I read. "You should never have touched something that did not belong to you. You had no right to disturb what was sealed. You will pay severely for what you have done, more than you already have. Per the stipulation and terms in your leasing contract, your lease is terminated, effective immediately. All access to the property is revoked. Your security deposit and the prorated rent payment will not be refunded. Your belongings have been moved to a nearby storage facility. This is our final communication." My stomach turned as I reread the words. It wasn't the curt tone, the termination, or the eviction itself. It was the line that lingered in my mind, cutting deeper with every repetition. "You will pay severely for what you have done, more than you already have." Graham read over my shoulder and shook his head. "I told you, you shouldn't have opened that box." Things got worse when Julia's parents filed a missing person report. The police came to us first. It made sense. We were her roommates. Her car was still at the house, and all of her belongings were left behind. For a while, it felt like we were under constant suspicion. They questioned us, searched our residence, and even went through our phones. We told them everything, though we kept the more unbelievable parts to ourselves. Eventually, they stopped coming around, but the shadow of suspicion never really left. Julia's face started showing up on flyers around town, taped to lampposts, pinned on bulletin boards. Seeing them made my stomach twist. When we finally moved into a small apartment downtown, it felt like we could start fresh. For a while, things seemed normal, but that email stayed with us, a constant reminder of what we'd left behind. You will pay severely for what you have done. I couldn't shake the words. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I heard Julia's voice or the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. Graham never mentioned it, but I could tell it was eating at him too. Months have passed now. No shadows, no voices, no signs of Julia. Her parents are still looking for her. The world has moved on, but we haven't. Life looks normal from the outside, but Graham and I are just waiting for a knock on the door, a face in the crowd, the other shoe to drop. But normal doesn't feel safe anymore. Nothing does. Now, we're both just waiting, bracing for whatever comes next.